Did you know giving to Hope Worldwide is quick and easy? Simply go to HOPEww.org/donate to set up a donation online. Enter an amount you would like to give. Please consider making this a recurring monthly gift so that, together, we can help meet vital needs throughout the year. Click Submit. Finally, enter and submit your contact and payment information to complete the donation process. It's as simple as that. Your generous gift will have tremendous impact. Together, we are loving our neighbors in need as we inspire greater hope in our world. Thank you for supporting Hope Worldwide.
No one, no man, no woman, no child should have to live in a world of fear, insecurity, and terror. Hopelessness is said to be more destructive than any weapon on earth. Far too many of our fellow men are living in despair. This, my friend, should not be. You see, we know how to bring hope to every single person on earth. When you acknowledge each person's inherent dignity, respect their humanity, and bring kindness, you bring them hope. And we know that when people have hope, they have a future. When you bring hope into a community, it transforms them. It changes everything. To bring a person or a family or a whole region from a place of desperation to a place of hope, you have truly made a difference. When you bring hope to somebody, you don't just change their day. You have revolutionized their world and their worldview. You restore faith in humanity and revive the belief that there are still good people in this world. We believe in a world where every single person has hope for their life and sees a brighter future. We are committed to fighting for everyone to have this hope in their life. Through compassion, excellence, and integrity, we will restore hope worldwide.
Tonight we have a very special guest, Marty Solomon. His teaching has deepened my faith and my love for the scriptures, and I know so many of you have had similar experience. We're excited and honored to hear from him, and after the lesson, our own Ben Barnett and Naomi Stephan will do a brief interview with him. So, with no further delay, I give you Marty Solomon.
At the beginning of the Bible, we are told about a special relationship where God essentially chooses a partner with whom he's going to put the world back together. His name is Abram. Later his name becomes Abraham, and there's a story in Genesis 18 where God says something very, very interesting. It's a story right before what we know as Sodom and Gomorrah, and God has come and he's dining together with Abraham and Sarah, and they have a unique conversation. And then God is on his way, leaving that dinner, on his way to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then God says something really interesting in Genesis 18, verse 19. He says, I should tell Abraham what I'm about to do. And he says the reason that he should tell Abraham what he's about to do is because he has chosen Abraham, because he's going to teach his household and those that come after him how to do righteousness and justice. Righteousness and justice. Now these are two very important words to the Hebrew scriptures. The word righteousness is the word zedekah, and it refers to things being in right relationship. The state of being in right relationship is zedekah, or righteousness. I think when you and I think of righteousness, we think of doing the right things, following the rules, right living. I think we think of that as righteousness. And it's connected, but it's really not the Hebrew idea at all. It's the state of being in right relationship. That's zedekah. And then the other word is the word for justice, and it's the word mishpat. So God says that Abraham is going to teach his household how to do zedekah and mishpat. Now mishpat is doing the work of putting those relationships back together, those right relationships when they've been distorted, when they've been disrupted. So the Jews will often talk about what they call shalom. And they'll talk about shalom in terms of sometimes a triangle, which represents three different kinds of relationships, where you have God in one corner, mankind, humanity in another, and creation in the other. And this triangle represents relationships that need to be right. They need to be in right relationship. You need to have right relationships between God and creation. You need to have right relationships between God and humanity. And you need a right relationship between humanity and creation. When all these things are in perfect harmony, when you have tzedakah, right relationship, you have shalom, everything in its proper place. But we live in a world where shalom has been disrupted, where those straight paths have been made crooked, where right relationship has been distorted and disrupted. And so what you do when tzedakah, the state of being in right relationship, is disrupted, is you pursue mishpat, which is the making right, the actions that make right what has been made crooked and distorted. The Jews have a modern description for this. They call it tikkun olam, is the modern Jewish phrase. Tikkun olam, which means the repairing of the world. The putting of the world back together. In biblical terms, it was called righteousness and justice. And this theme goes all throughout Scripture. It's a very important. You know how often the Bible talks about righteousness and justice. In fact, in the Psalms, it says that righteousness and justice, tzedakah and mishpat, are the foundation of God's throne. That God's throne sits on the foundation of righteousness and justice. That's a pretty big idea, if I do say so myself. And really, starting all the way back in Torah, this is unbelievably important. We just heard from the book of Genesis about righteousness and justice and the partnership that God was forming with his people. You could go to the book of Leviticus, just 2 books later, and look at this whole Levitical law, this whole holiness code, and you could realize that the book of Leviticus is a gigantic chiasm. For any of you that have listened to our podcast, you know what a chiasm is. There's a front half to the book and a back half to the book, and they serve as like a mirror. The two halves parallel each other in order to tell us a larger story about what's taking place in Leviticus. Now, in this discussion, the front half of Leviticus is really a discussion in many ways about tzedakah. It's about how to be in right relationship, how to be in right relationship with God, how to be in right relationship with others, how to be in right relationship with the world around you, how to be in right relationship with other people. The first half of Leviticus is really about tzedakah. Now, the back half of Leviticus is really about justice. What do you do when the first half of Leviticus doesn't work or gets disrupted or somebody screws it up? What do you do when tzedakah, the tzedakah of the first half, is disrupted by our own rebellion, our own mistakes, our own sin? Well, the back half of Leviticus is really about mishpat. The first half is about how to do it right. The second half is what to do when you get it wrong. And so you have all of these instances and these commandments that have to do with mishpat and justice. When somebody makes a mistake and gets pushed out of the community, how do you get them back into the community? When somebody doesn't have all of everything in order and they end up having needs, how do you meet those needs? You have this relationship, even in Leviticus, between righteousness and justice. And what it does is it tries to teach us, it tries to teach God's people how to live in a world that is completely connected to itself. There aren't these different categories. It's not my world and your world. It's not us versus them. It's a very integrated relationship pointed towards shalom. Everything needing to be in its proper place. So the way that we farm our fields and the way that we pursue relationships and the way that we worship God, all of it is about putting everything in its proper place. And all the relationships we have with other people are all connected in the same idea together. Not an us versus them, not an in versus out, not an up versus down. I'm above you, you're below me. But Leviticus really paints a picture of an integrated community. working together to pursue shalom. And then eventually you get to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy has this call to it that really is asking people at the end of Torah, it's asking God's people to always remember where they came from. Some 19, 20, 21 times, the book of Deuteronomy calls God's people to remember. Remember your story. Remember the history of where you came from. Remember who you are. Because then that will keep you on track. That will keep you on mission with God, to remember this partnership that God started all the way back with Abraham in those opening chapters of the Bible. And one of the things that it always invites us to remember in Deuteronomy is that we were slaves in Egypt. Slaves in Egypt. In fact, I just pulled up on Bible Gateway, my online concordance. I just pulled up, I went to, and just did slaves in Egypt, and I'm looking at the references that came up in Deuteronomy. The first reference that comes up in Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy chapter 5, which is where God's retelling essentially the Ten Commandments, what we know as the Ten Commandments. And it gets to the law on Sabbath, and it talks about keeping the Sabbath day and making it holy. And at the end of it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that is why the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath is somehow connected to remembering our story and remembering that we were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord our God brought us out of there with a mighty hand. The very next chapter, Deuteronomy 6, tells us to remember to tell our children the story about how we were slaves in Egypt. Tell this son that asked you a question, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And then you go on a few more chapters in Deuteronomy, and then all of a sudden you get a conversation in Deuteronomy 15 and Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 15, where it says this, it says, if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I command you to do this. So God says, in this world, shalom's been disrupted. We have all of these relationships where some people don't have, and they end up indebted to other people who do have. And God recognizes the presence of these systems, and he says, but at the end of that time, see, this is a fixed amount of time, and at the end of that time, you need to let them go free and make sure you supply them liberally from your own surplus, from your own winepress, from your own food pantry, from your own bank account. Why? Because the shalom that God designed for our world has been disrupted, and I'm calling you to be somebody who lives in the state of right relationship and helps pursue mishpat, righteousness, and justice. Let's see here. And then we have, let's go back. Then we have Deuteronomy 16. Oh, this is a fun one. 16 verse 12. Count off 7 weeks. We're in verse 9. Count off 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. Then celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God by giving a free will offering in proportion to the blessings of the Lord that the Lord your God has given you. And rejoice before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites in your towns, and the foreigners, the fatherless and the widows living among you. And here's this theme that we talk about in our podcast: the alien, the orphan, and the widow. The foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. The foreigner, the father, and then this phrase: remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and follow carefully these decrees. So God says, okay, every year we're going to throw this huge party. Make sure that everybody is there. Again, just like in Leviticus, there is no us and them. There's no rich and poor. There's no male nor female. There's no like in crowd and out crowd. It's not like only one group of people gets to show up to the party. Everybody shows up at the party. The servants and the slaves, the landowners, the men and the women, the children and the grandparents. Everybody shows up because we're all a part of this thing that we're pursuing. Zedekah, Mishpat, Shalom. And God says, you know why we do this? Because we were slaves in Egypt. And we remember where we come from. And we remind ourselves that we're really no better than that group of people. We're not somehow above. You see, part of what Deuteronomy does, well, let's keep going. Because in the very next chapter, we're going to run into some more. Actually, if we were to go to Deuteronomy 24, we end up bumping into a few different instances here. Deuteronomy 24, do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice. Here's that same group of people, alien, orphan, widow. Do not deprive the foreigner or fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you're harvesting your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. But God, it's my sheaf, it's my field. I worked to farm that field. Like, that's the fruit of my labor. God says, leave it. Why? Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God might bless you in the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. And I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, I'm just going to make sure that I beat the olive tree really thoroughly the first time so there's nothing left. Which seems to defeat the purpose of what God's trying to teach us, right? Okay. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. But God, I've done all the work to grow the vineyard. I've done all the work to cultivate the olive trees. I've done all the work to harvest the field. Why would you ask me to do this? Here's why. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Remember the story of where you came from. Remember where you came from. And so one of the things that we talk about in this journey is that you spend time remembering when you see the alien, the orphan, and the widow. You remember that you were alien, orphans, and widows. And so out of compassion, you reach out to them and you help them. But then something happens. Because those alien, orphans, and widows talk back to you and they remind you of something so central about your own humanity. This is a reciprocal relationship. Something that's had in solidarity. It's a flat community. It seems slanted because it feels like you have something and they lack something. And so it feels like there's this top down. And yet what God is doing is God is saying there is something about your own salvation, your own redemption, that is bound up in who they are and what they're going to teach you. It's not just what you are going to give to them, but it's also about what they give to you. Should you ever forget this process, by the way? Should you ever forget? Let's look at the last verse that comes up. What's the last reference to slaves in Egypt in Deuteronomy? Well, it shows up in Deuteronomy 28, which is actually a chapter all about warning. It's warning God's people. You've got to do you got to do what God asks us to do, because if not, I'll tell you what's going to happen. And we run into this. Among those nations you will find no repose. If you don't do what God's asked you to do, you're going to end up what? Listen, no resting place no Sabbath. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both day and night, never sure of your life. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening. In the evening, if only it were morning, because of the terror that will fill your heart and the sights that your eyes will see. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt. God says, listen, I need you to remember where you came from. I need you to remember who you are. I need you to see the outsider, the mumser, the alien, the orphan, the widow, those people who are marginalized, those who have needs. I need you to see them, and I need you to not just help them, I need you to be reminded by them. They're going to do you a favor and remind you of something critical about who you are and who you're called to be. This is a reciprocal relationship, and the moment that you forget that, the moment that this is no longer a flat conversation where we all show up at the party, right? The moment you forget that is the moment that this stops to become flat and it starts to become slanted. And it starts to become this top-down thing. And it starts to become this thing where I have and you don't have. The moment that you start to forget all of this, that's the moment that God will send you right back to Egypt to remind you. The moment that you start to, because what happens is you start to have this like, I'm coming to serve you. I'm coming to save you because I'm on top and you're on bottom. And it's just a couple steps away from that relationship where you actually find yourself leveraging the poor, exploiting those underneath you, becoming the very antithesis, the anti-story, we like to say in the podcast. You become the very opposite thing of what God invited you to do and become. We can read about this in the book of Isaiah. One of my favorite chapters is Isaiah chapter 58. And this is really a prophet speaking to God's people after they've gotten this out of whack. They haven't remembered where they came from. They haven't upheld God's economy, God's rules. They haven't kept the community of God's people. They are not experiencing Tzedakah. They're not pursuing Shalom. And they're doing the opposite of justice. They're actually leveraging the story to get more and more out of it for themselves. And so the prophet comes and has some harsh words for them. The prophet Isaiah says, "Shout it aloud and do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its gods. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed?" So this group of people is very religious. They're doing all the right things. They're getting all their worship right. And they're saying, "God, why aren't you answering our prayers? We're following all the rules. We're doing all the things you want us to do." God says, "Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves?" God says, you say you're so religious, and yet all your relationships are out of whack. All your relationships are about you exploiting your workers and this us versus them, top down, in and out. Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see them naked, to clothe them and not turn away from your own flesh and blood? God says, you think you're so religious, but you've lost the plot of righteousness and justice. You don't care about putting the world back together. You're not trying to make things right and restore right relationship. You don't even care about your own, and then what does Isaiah say? Your own flesh and blood. You don't even realize that this is your own family. This is your own shared humanity. You're just here to exploit workers and take advantage, to be somebody on the top and to act like you're taking care of the people on the bottom. You've lost the plot of the story. There's no shalom. There's no solidarity. You're not identifying with people that are in need. If you do this, your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of streets with dwellings. What is that? That's tikkun olam. That's mishpat. You see, if you'll spend yourself on behalf of the hungry, if you'll clothe the naked, if you'll do these things, if you'll give yourself, not because you're on top, not because there's some pyramid scheme where you're at the top and you get to come down and serve those below you, but if you see yourself as a part of a much larger community and remember where you came from, well then mishpat, well then we're talking about righteousness and justice. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please by speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. I hear of Isaiah's words. I hear him speaking about clothing the naked, and it makes me think of the parable of Jesus. Remember the parable of the sheep and the goats? And Jesus has sheep and goats, and he says, You clothed me when I was naked. You gave me food when I was hungry, drink when I was thirsty. You visited me when I was in prison. One group says, When did we see that? The other group says, When did we see that? And Jesus says, When you did it to the least of these. Isn't it interesting that Jesus chooses to identify with the poor? Jesus chooses to see himself in solidarity with the needy. Jesus identifies with the least of these. Jesus says we are all bound up together. There is no category. There is no specific. There is no you have and the other has not. There's none of that in God's good world. It makes me think of one last passage in James as we go to close. James chapter 1, he says, Believers in humble circumstances, so believers on the bottom, ought to take pride in their high position. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation. There's something that happens, the New Testament says, when you get to have all the things that you want and you need, and the security is all there, and the richness and the wealth is yours. There's something dangerous that happens where you need to be reminded about the true self, reminded about where you came from, reminded that we're all supposed to be at the party, right? But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. But the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom fails and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. A little bit later in chapter 2, James says, Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are you not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name to whom you belong? There is this solidarity that we are called to. There is a danger when we take God's remember where you came from. When you see people in need, see yourself. And when you go to them and you find yourself, when you identify with them and walk alongside of them and listen to their stories and see their humanity, what they'll do is they'll remind you of your own humanity, which somehow you've lost in the midst of all of the stuff that you do have and the blessing that seems to get twisted. This is all a part of the work of righteousness and justice. Righteousness and justice. Tikkun olam, the repairing of the world. May God save us from this narrative that tells us that we have something to give, that we are descending to help other people out, would we be reminded that when we go down the ladder, what we find is a group of people reminding us of who we truly are, that they are actually serving us in amazing ways, because at the end of the day, we're all supposed to be at the party together. May God bless us and keep us in the work of righteousness and justice. Amen.
Marty, that was a fantastic message. We are so grateful to have you be able to speak at our U.S. volunteer training event. I am also joined here today. Oh, by the way, I'm the Chief Evangelist, Ben Barnett of Hope Worldwide, and I am joined here today by one of our young, very competent and compassionate staff members at Hope Worldwide, Naomi Stephan. She's the coordinator of Hope Worldwide's youth programs. And Naomi, it is great to have you here today. And I look forward to your thoughts, insights, and reflections. I wish we had the opportunity and time to really take a deep dive into Marty's message. There's a lot of material that was there, but we're going to lean into some things today rather than do a deep dive and really enjoy the time that we have here today. Some immediate thoughts I have about the message, Marty, is the relationship that you connect to righteousness and justice, Zedekah, Mishpat, those being predicated on a full understanding of what Shalom is. I think a couple themes that ran through your message that stand out for me, I sat here and took notes, is remembering where you come from, remembering your history, remembering your partnership with God. I think you also illuminated a thread that runs through the entire scripture from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the idea about engaging certain demographics of people to include the widow, the orphan, the alien. I would also add to that the poor. These four are sometimes referred to as the quartet of the vulnerable. Perhaps we can lean into that a little bit. And then the idea of solidarity and identity with those different populations. So these are a few things that we can, sit here and chop it up a little bit. But for starters, I want to begin our dialogue and kind of question back and forth with a question about righteousness and about justice. You said in your message that Zedekah is about being rooted in right relationships. And so I know as disciples of Jesus and people of faith, we often focus on having right relationships within the body of Christ, the church, as well as we should. Those are very important. I believe that's what the Bible teaches. But how does the concept of Zedekah, right relationships, apply to our relationships with the larger community around us?
Yeah, that's a good question. And these terms are related in that Hebrew mind to this driving picture and image of shalom. Like you have, and shalom is all encompassing. Shalom is not, categorized only in this, slice of, the experience of God's people. But shalom is about all of creation. It's about everything being in right relationship. And so all these words have these entangled, they're interrelated. Like they have these relationships with each other. And so Zedekah being this, and the word comes from this idea of straightness, trueness. And so we've often, in one understanding, and it's not entirely incorrect, we've associated that with right living, like following the rules, walking straightly. But in that Hebrew mind, and there's all kinds of explanation of how this works in the Hebrew language. Hebrew is unbelievably intricate. There's 8,000 Hebrew words in biblical Hebrew. There's 400,000 in the English language that we use today. So that gives you 8,000 to 400,000 is quite a difference. So there's so much depth packed into every Hebrew word and how it's constructed, and its relationship with its root. But their understanding, if we take the short story here, is right relationship, being in right relationship. And this just isn't relationships with people. It's everything in the world being as it should be. It's that concept of shalom. So you have our relationships with God, but you have our relationships with each other, but you also have our relationship with creation itself. And you can't just focus on one group of relationships. You can't just focus on even one category of relationships, because if any one of those things gets disentangled and gets, somehow gets made crooked, well, all of shalom is impacted by that. And so if you're going to focus on righteousness, it's going to have to be a very, very complete righteousness. It's going to have to be a righteousness that entails all relationships with all people, all things, a relationship with God, everything being in right relationship with each other.
Yeah. I appreciate that, Marty. Thank you. I wanted to start off with that question. You even mentioned in your message about in Psalms, it talks about God's throne being a foundation of justice and righteousness. And to be quite honest, I've been a disciple for a number of years now, and it's only been probably within maybe the last year and a half or 2 years that it seemed like a conversation around justice and righteousness has become vogue. Perhaps that is propagated because of what's going on in the world. But I do appreciate being able to understand the difference in two, and having this conversation be first grounded upon an understanding of that and shalom, because then everything else makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is the fact that we disconnected these conversations between Jew and Gentile some 1800 years ago, because the Jewish conversation has always on some level revolved around this concept of shalom and justice. Now it's had its own evolution. It's gone in and out of different things in the Jewish experience, but their conversations always kind of revolved around that idea as a pretty central theme. And for Christian thought, and we won't get too deep into Christian history, we took an off ramp and our conversation kind of went in different directions. And now I think largely because of bringing those two stories back together for the last 50 years academically in the world of scholarship, bringing that Jewish scholarship and Christian Catholic scholarship together has brought the conversation, it's brought more awareness, the rise of kingdom theology, which has been so helpful, has just made us aware of some things that have probably lied a little neglected in Christian thought for centuries and centuries. So I too appreciate, because it's a huge, if it's the foundation of God's throne, and I'm not prepared to do some massive exegetical lesson on what that means, but if it's the foundation of God's throne, that's where God's presence and his throne sits, is on these two ideas of righteousness and justice. Whatever else comes out, it's built on that foundation. That's a pretty big idea and a big picture there in the Psalms. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I think this is certainly pertinent and relevant to what Hope Worldwide tries to do, being a global nonprofit who engages, I would say that quartet of the vulnerable that I mentioned all around the world, and really being a faith-based organization that is trying to work at the heart of God and the vision of God. So I'm glad we're able to have this discussion. I know that Naomi had a couple questions that she wanted to ask you as well.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate that, kind of going back to what the foundation is. And I think a lot of times when we talk about the foundation of Christianity, we just talk about love, but really seeing how that is encompassed by righteousness and justice. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to kind of shift a little bit to talk about how you talked about the us versus them, in versus out, above, below, and that language that a lot of times we use when we talk about so-called service work of I'm serving you, and there's this clear divide. And I think something that I've noticed is kind of as we seek to change our way around service, or our thinking around service, it can still be, it's instead of I'm serving you, it's, you're teaching me, but it still has that same divide in it, which I know is in contrast to shalom, as you talked about. And so how do you see that mentality among Christians you have connected with, and what perspectives can you share about how we're able to move further towards a mindset that reflects God and his people and what he sets forth in the Old Testament as his idea of justice and righteousness?
We have this concept, and it goes way back to the world that we have always known and loved, this Greco-Roman world of strength and efficacy and efficiency. And you build, like, there's a system, and the system is what gives us, if we were to shortcut it and maybe be a little graceful with this conversation, it's the system that gives us security. We can know what's coming. We can lean on this. But that system was built on knowing the categories and knowing who fits in the categories and knowing where I fit in those categories. And those categories were naturally structured in hierarchical ways. Like there was a hierarchy there that was driving the conversation. And so naturally what we do is we end up finding our security in knowing my place, which is only bolstered by knowing that there are other people outside of my place. And that's where we seem to run and cling to that security an awful lot. And I do love what you said about this distinction, the distinction running counter shalom, because there should be this unified wholeness to humanity. Instead of seeing me as the one that's here to bless you, or even like you here to teach me, but when you look at to see this blessed humanity, where we all have something different, we're all bringing something different, but we, like Romans will go to great length at the very end of the letter. One of the parts of Romans we never talk about how these other people can actually instruct you. And he's talking to this Jewish audience, and he's saying these brand new Gentiles have something to teach you. They have something to, and so in that you do see this paradox that I think you're referencing here. Like on some level, you have to see the uniqueness of each and every person. You have to be able to look at somebody and be like, I see what's unique about you. It's not this like kind of washing away of our unique attributes and the unique things we bring to the table to make us all uniform. I always love to say like unity and uniformity are two wildly different things. Like you don't have unity and like uniformity is anti-unity. Actually, unity is only unity if you see those unique parts of us that make us different. So there's this paradox of being able to look at somebody and know, but not to see a better, worse, us, them, in, out, above, below, to just see different but human. Like you are one of me and I am one of you, and we are all tangled up. And to go back to Ben's question, this is what's tied up in this idea of shalom and tzedakah and righteousness. I can't categorize because we're all bound up in this idea of shalom and righteousness together. We have to be. There's no up and down in that, because if any part of this is out of whack, if any part of this is crooked, the whole thing suffers. So I have to see every human being as intricately tied up in this thing that we call humanity, this world that God's made and loves, the world that God's redeeming, and the thing that he's wanting to put back together and restore. So I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you connected that to it's a part of the restoration of humanity. And as you mentioned earlier about kingdom theology, being able to live out God's kingdom or what he desires on this earth. And I also just really appreciate what you said about how it's unity without uniformity. And there's still a need to recognize that uniqueness, but not to necessarily do so in a way that needs to be categorized by this hierarchical structure. And so I guess kind of as a follow-up to that, how would you see that changing the way that we see our relationships and practically act towards kind of the quartet that Ben was referencing, the alien, the orphan, the widow, and those experiencing poverty?
Yeah, I think the one thing we have to be aware of is our relationship to the norm, like the normative, whatever the norm is. And that changes depending on our context. I know you'll have people from all over the world in all kinds of different contexts probably listening to this. So that context isn't just an American context. It can be all kinds of different things. But to be aware of what normative is, and then realizing what our relationship is with that in comparison to whatever those other groups are. I mean, I love that Ben took those three and made it a quartet, because really the Hebrew expression of poor, the Hebrew idea of poverty is connected to that very reality. Poor actually references in the Hebrew mind very little to monetary status. It relates to their status in community. Like the idea of being poor in the Hebrew is the fact that you are not a part of something. You are not a part of the larger thing that should be helping sustain you as a human being. And so the alien, the orphan, the widow constitute in very large part, almost in whole in their world, the poor, because if you were the alien, if you were the orphan, if you were the widow, you were not a part of the normative experience. You were on the outsides, you were pushed to the margins, and therefore you were poor. And that led to a very real practical, financial, monetary poverty as well, but it's being driven by the fact that none of this poverty would exist if they were seen as a part of the larger community, if we saw all of us together in the whole story. And so, and again, we love to protect our norms and then serve out of our norms. A lot of us are a part of the normative experience on some level, whether it's affluence or whatever those things might be. And then we serve out of that norm. We kind of go out of the norm to the fringes and serve them. And one of the things we see, one of my favorite pictures in the Torah is in the desert, God taught his people how to put the weak and the marginalized, not on the fringes, not on the outsides, but in the center of the community. One of the rabbinic understandings is that God has the tribe of Dan bring up the rear as they walk all throughout I think that's in Numbers 25, might be in Numbers 10. I can never remember the reference. But in the book of Numbers, God says, we're going to have you go out and take up the rear, so that all those that are slow, those that are weak, those that are elderly, those that lag behind, those on the outside, they're within the larger group. They're not straggling behind. And that's really the image that's what we've missed, is we think everybody is okay on the margins, okay on the fringes, as long as they have, access to the norm. But in God's kingdom, you bring them in, you embrace them, you absorb them into the normative experience, recognizing that they were never supposed to be on the fringes to begin with. I feel like there's like a million other things I want to say, but anyway, that's where I'll stop for now. Good question.
Yeah, I think something else that we were talking about, kind of like been referenced, especially over the last 2 years, there's been a lot more conversation around justice and what that means, both in our world and in our churches. And so I guess more in a general sense, how do you envision the daily life of a follower of Jesus changing, or what it would look like if they really understand these overarching themes of tzedakah and mishpah in the scriptures? And how does that change the way we treat our local community? And how can we have, this is, I know, a large question, but how can we have those conversations amidst everything that's going on or has been brought up in the world that can oftentimes lead to very emotional attachment to all of these conversations?
We need to start seeing the humanity of people first, not second. We need to start seeing, when we see people, especially those who are not a part of our crowd, our tribe, when we see those people that are on the fringes, be it their socioeconomic status or racial identity or whatever those things are, anything, believers, non-believers, we need to start, when we see them, we need to see the fact that they're human, like they're human beings made in the image of God, image bearers. Like we need to start relating to them. Our first relationship, our first posture needs to come by seeing their humanity. And so, okay, here's a little tidbit. I just was in a meeting with my therapist yesterday. All right. Yes, I do that. Why? Because it's very healthy for me to do that. And I was sitting with my counselor, and she was talking to me about how more and more and more groups are using improv to help us become more healthy people, especially leaders in all kinds of facets. And it's because one of the few rules of improv is that you have to affirm what just came before you and build, like you can write whatever the next chapter of that story is, but you cannot go backwards, and you cannot critique, and the only thing you can do is affirm what got the story to this point and build off of it. And so it teaches this knee-jerk reaction to affirm whatever that person just brought to the table, to affirm. And what it teaches you, I believe, what it's tapping into is it's teaching you how to see people as something that can be affirmed. It doesn't mean that we condone everything we ever find in every single human being. It means that when we see somebody, we can teach ourselves to affirm their humanity. I don't need to know anything else about them to just affirm the fact that they're human beings made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And from there, my next steps that build off of that, well, then they take the conversation somewhere. Then they take my service somewhere. Then they take our relationship somewhere together. But I cannot position myself against them, but affirm them and in a sense say, I welcome, you have entered my life. Welcome to my life. And that's one posture, but this is multifaceted. That was intense for like, oh yeah, I got one more question. That was an intense question. That had a lot of layers to it because there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yes, I know it was many questions in one. So I appreciate that response and kind of addressing those different parts. And I really love I think I had a couple thoughts as you were talking, what you said towards the end about really recognizing people's humanity and recognizing that first. Because I think even if you look at historically and you look at, something that I studied in school, so looking at the roots of colonialism and kind of going back to all of that, how so much of that just has to do with not seeing people's humanity first. And so seeing how that continues in our world, and it's not just something that happened back then, it's something that definitely calls me higher. I wanted to ask Marty as well, if you have any more practical applications for our volunteers in terms of how they can not only shift their thinking, but how that would be reflected in their community engagement work or interactions with those experiencing poverty.
Maybe the next step, and now you're starting to get out of my wheelhouse and out of my expertise, but just having that very next layer of, if this is the impact they've had on me, what does this say about what is the shared experience with all of us? Like, have some kind of one more step that removes the us versus them, the server versus the servee, to like, what we really experience is that we were all bound up together. And maybe finding that tail end of Romans. And I wish I had my reference on me. I don't at the moment, but that passage about even these Gentiles have something to teach all you Jews. Like, what happens when we put ourselves in the same experience together and in Christ realize what is my poverty? What is my, to have those intentional conversations that get us all bound up, and then maybe to project maybe a little bit into the future. How does this change the way I live when I go back home? In what ways am I going to encounter this? Because really the reasons we engage in this is so that we bring shalom to all of, like, we don't want to leave our context to go bring shalom somewhere else and then go back to, like, we do that just so that we come back to our own context and identify with it more appropriately. So those are the things that connecting those dots, probably one of the best things we can do.
Yeah, that's awesome. Definitely very helpful.
And one more, Naomi, I'll give you one more. Who are I always tell my students this, so I might as well tell you guys. What is the one or two relationships that you are intentionally going to build? Like, you likely know somebody or have seen somebody or don't know them yet, but you know of them. And go build one or two relationships that demonstrate this weird, wacky, invite everybody to the banquet, make sure everybody's at the party. You likely know that there's somebody in your life, somebody you drive past every day, somebody that you interact with, some people group, and you're going to intentionally build a relationship, not for the purpose of, not as a means to an end, but the end is the fact that we're binding ourselves together in a shared human experience. That would be maybe an even more practical. I always told my students coming back from our Israel trips, don't ever throw a party where you don't invite somebody you would have never invited before this trip. Like, make sure you're changing the way you do that, you create these spaces. So there's some practical thoughts.
I've really enjoyed your message. As I mentioned, I've also enjoyed the dialogue that we have here, especially, what Naomi had to offer to our conversation as well. She is, so encouraging to be so young and competent and compassionate at this place in her life. So I really like what she had to say to our conversation. I wish we could talk forever. Maybe we can have some follow-up going in the future. But I wanted to kind of just go ahead and close things out a little bit. And as I do that, I just want to bring up another thing that I saw through your message and heard through your message was about, you talked about being invited to the party, the great party. I thought it'd be great to just close out on a thought about that. And it made me think about Jesus again teaching in Luke chapter 14 about the great banquet. and where the master sends the servant out to invite people to the great banquet, and he goes out, and it says all the people that they invited began to make excuses of why they couldn't be there. And so the servant comes back and says, nobody wants to come to the banquet. They got other things to do. And the master says, well, go out into the streets and alleys and find the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame and invite them. And from all apparent things from the text, they came and they showed up at the party, and there was still room for more. I love that part. There was still room. So he sends the servant out again and says, go out to the country lanes and the streets, go to the rural areas and find people to come to. And so that's what I love. Conversation here. I think it is one fitting for a party and a celebration. And when we find shalom in the world, and we help engage it in righteousness and justice and mutuality and respect, I think we begin to create that party that is in the world and what we get to be a part of. Did you have any closing thoughts at all, Marty?
Nope, that's pretty good. Somebody should have told Jesus that's not very good theology. But other than that, oh boy. Yeah, no, I love that connection there. I just love the image. Like, it's been such a dominant image. Old Testament, New. This is not a brand new idea. We're not reaching to some fringe passage to make a point. This has been such a consistent idea. Invite everybody. Make sure everybody is at your festival. Do not make it just about those that have it, the landowners or the rich or the Israelites, or this is about bring the foreigners, bring the servants, bring everybody, make sure everybody is there. And then Jesus has to remind us because we all forgot. Yeah. And the question is, would Jesus have to remind us today? Because maybe we've forgotten again, and that's okay. But now we get to say yes. So let's say yes. Absolutely. Well, Marty, thank you so much for really joining us today and offering your wisdom and gifts and talents to this conversation. I'm quite sure many in our audience already follow you, because everywhere I go, people mention Marty Solomon and your podcast. For those that do not follow you, maybe would like to know, you want to let the audience know how and where they might find you? Yeah, you can find the BEMA podcast, spell it BEMA. BEMA, the BEMA podcast. You can find it on pretty much any podcast platform, or just go to BEMADiscipleship.com and you can find us there. All right. Well, thank you, Marty. Thank you, Naomi, for this conversation. I also want to say thank you to a silent part of this conversation, those who are listening. Thanks to all of our compassionate and competent volunteers for carving out your time to join this sacred space. Pray that God will bless us and that we'll all be able to engage in this great party called God's kingdom.
That was amazing. Oh my gosh. I don't know about you, but I could listen to that all night. There's so much that was just shared that we can learn from. I think that what really resonates with me is the discussion about Jesus teaching that when we bind ourselves with the least of these, when we minister to the widow, the orphan, the alien, people who are marginalized or oppressed, and when we allow them to minister right back to us, that's one way we really connect to Jesus. And Isaiah 58 tells us that is when our healing quickly appears and our light will break forth like the dawn. I am very personally challenged by that, because these last couple of years has been really hard for me, and I know it's been hard for every one of us. And yet, when I pull back and I don't engage with my neighbors who are materially poor or in need, I might be keeping myself from receiving the healing Jesus has for me. I hope that we'll all take to heart Marty's lesson and the scriptures that were shared tonight. I encourage everyone listening, if you're not engaging with local neighbors who are poor or in need, and on a consistent basis, the way Jesus demonstrated to us, not just once a year or a few times a year, but in your day-to-day life, join us in this. If you don't know how, check out the 2 webinars I referred to earlier, or connect with your local Hope Worldwide chapter, Campus Club, Hope Scouts Troop, the National Youth Advisory Council, or contact us at Hope Worldwide. We have a lot of great resources to help you get going and keep going. Thank you, Ben and Naomi, and especially thank you, Marty Solomon, for teaching us tonight. Everyone, be sure to check out the BEMA podcast if you haven't already. And finally, thanks to every single one of you for joining us. May God bless you, and we'll see you next time.